had the pleasure of first working with her when I was next door at the Brannigan for the Journey Stories exhibit, where she presented and lectured and did a workshop on the paisley motif and its travels around the world. So I naturally thought of her when this exhibit was planned, not only because of her expertise on printmaking, but because of her broad knowledge of studio art, art history, and her unique ability to connect the treasures and stories of India and other parts of Asia with those of the rest of the world. Now, the influence of Japanese woodcuts on modern Western art.
Thank you, Andy, and the Museum of Art. We are going to talk about how Japanese woodblock prints, which came to Europe at a certain period right before modernism, modern art started taking shape. And it was just the perfect timing. Everything we know today as not just modern art that's in museums and galleries, but also design, all the graphic arts like illustrations, magazine illustrations, advertisement art in Europe and America, and then the rest of the world that we know as modern or postmodern designs actually has some connection or the other through the modern artists, the Impressionists and post-Impressionists connection with the Japanese woodblock print. So it's really, really an important art heritage for all of us. I call it global heritage. So this is the Japanese woodblock print makers' interpretation of the ship that came to the shore of Tokyo, which is called Edo at the time. Until then, until 1853 is when this ship arrived at the shore of Japan. Right before that, Japan was very, very insular. It was close to the rest of the world, so to speak. Japanese people were not allowed to go outside, outsiders were not allowed to come inside, etc., etc. So they were very, very suspicious of foreign influence. And the ruling class, totally to keep their control, made sure there is no connection with regular people and the outside world. But that changed when this trade relation opened up. Let's investigate, before we talk about how exactly these prints influenced the European artists, we need to see what was going on in Europe in terms of art until then. Then only we can see the difference. So this is from an earlier period by Rembrandt, and you can see the style for high art in Europe until then. Not very colorful, kind of dark interiors. Of course, there was no electricity, so the interiors, and Europe not being a very sunny place, it's understandable. And everything was dependent on the source of light. So showing shadows, showing depth, showing tonal variation, that's how everything was defined. There was no outline. They eliminated the use of outlines completely and just made sure everything is defined by the way light falls on the surface. And we also know that perspective was invented and all that. So that trend continued until the Japanese influence came in. It's not like in Europe there was no tradition of outline, use of outline at all. There were medieval illumination, illuminated manuscripts and things like that. So there are examples in European art of use of outlines, but they were not seen as something for studio artists. The studio artists, for the first time, they got inspired by the Japanese use of outline. We mostly see interior scenes until then, but even if it's an outdoor scene, still it's basically, you can see no outline, it's all depth and illusion, everything is shown by the use of shadows. That means the source of light is very important. It always tells us where the light is coming from which direction. You can see on the faces the light is coming from this side, the other side is the darker area. So is this one. I just included these to picture this one and the previous one to show one example from England and one from France, that what kind of aesthetics was prevalent, what kind of art was going on right before this new influence came. Now, after the opening of trade, as we just saw that picture of the ship, the galleries and the gift shops, they started getting things from Japan. And even before the artists themselves actually absorbed some of these elements, even though it's done in European tradition, you can see the use of a Japanese screen in the background. Do you see that? So this is an example of how Japanese things are being included. It's being shown as aesthetically pleasing, cultured. People have access to it. The bourgeoisie, or people who have access to beautiful things, good things from the Orient. So a lot of the portraits and figure paintings have this small little, here and there you will see things from Japan, things from India. We see shawls and woven things, also from Middle East. And then afterwards, we know that Picasso was influenced by African masks. So this is the beginning of appreciation for art and culture from all over the world, but it's also part of the colonialism, and there is aspect of cultural appropriation, but that's again for another topic. We will move on. So this is a typical example of the kind of prints they saw. One of the very interesting things about it is we don't see this kind of portraits in European art until then. This flat use of color, there is no shading, not even any attempt at creating perspective, but it still looks so beautiful. It doesn't look flat. We actually can feel the space behind it. And the drawings are so delicate, totally a different kind of aesthetic sensibility. One of the interesting things that European artists really liked about this work and actually incorporated that in their work is how the figures get cut. It's not, the whole figure is not showing, and that's something in Renaissance style painting they never did. Renaissance style painting, it's always composed as though they are in a Greek style stage and we are just neutral, inert participants, or not participants in this case, we are just looking at what's going on. In these, the first time artists saw as though these figures, on the other hand, they are coming closer to us. We don't see the whole figure, they get cut, they come toward you and become alive in some way. They are more alive. They don't look like they are staged, they are fake, but they have been told to pose. You see the difference? It's like you really are there as part of the environment yourself. The other thing is that these were not like big oil paintings, and also they were published not to be seen and framed like displayed on wall, but to be looked at up close in a book or book-like binder or something. And some of these prints, interestingly, were first when these artists saw them, they were actually being used as packaging material. So sometimes it could be part of a page from a book or part of a larger print, not very large, but so things got cut to start with sometimes, and still because of the style, it looked very beautiful. Whereas had it been a canvas from the Renaissance period, if things got cut, it would look very odd. Of course, the artists who saw them, they thought that's the full composition. So these are some of the things that they were very impressed with. Things like the flat use of color and the background, very geometric lines. Sometimes they have diagonal lines, sometimes they have horizontal and vertical lines, very simple. Yet within that simplicity, there's such grand beauty and use of a lot of textures and patterns that are again that's not part of the Renaissance aesthetics. These are some of the things like cut of composition, we just talked about it. Then sometimes there will be silhouette of some figures in the background, or trees or boats or whatever, and even though they are not showing perspective in the traditional European sense, still you get a sense of space because of the way they are placed and they're shown as silhouette. So here are some examples of use of, I'm still getting used to which one is the pointer. So use of diagonal element in composition, and it's sometimes just diagonal lines to show a sense of implied perspective, if we say so. It's not perspective like the way the European artists worked it out, but this is a different way of describing the depth, implied sense of depth in the picture. This particular use of diagonal line, placing the figure in a diagonal way, none of these were there in earlier European paintings, and we'll see this over and over in many French artists in Impressionism and Post-Impressionism.